The first time I saw my grandmother's barn after she passed away, I almost turned the car around and drove straight back to the city. The building stood at the edge of an overgrown field, its walls crumbling like old bread, its roof sagging in the middle like a tired sigh. Paint peeled from the wooden boards in long, pale strips, and every window was either broken or missing entirely. The whole structure leaned slightly to the left, as if it had grown weary of standing upright after all these years. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 32 years old. For the past decade, I'd been living in Chicago, working as a graphic designer for a marketing firm. My life was comfortable but predictable. I lived in a small apartment with white walls and rented furniture. I had a boyfriend named Derek who worked in finance and talked mostly about interest rates and investment portfolios. My days blended together into an endless stream of computer screens and coffee cups and meetings that could have been emails. When Grandma Rose died at 93, she left me her property in rural Wisconsin. 50 acres of land and one dilapidated barn. The house she'd lived in had burned down years ago, and she'd moved into town. But she'd kept the land, paying taxes on it faithfully every year, never selling despite multiple offers from developers. "You're not seriously considering keeping it, are you?" Derek had asked when I told him about the inheritance. We were sitting in his sleek downtown condo, drinking wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. "Sarah, be practical. Sell the land, take the money, and invest it properly. That barn is probably going to collapse any day now." My coworkers shared his opinion. When I mentioned I was thinking about renovating the barn, they laughed. Actually laughed. Linda from accounting nearly spit out her coffee. "Honey," she said, wiping her mouth with a napkin, "I've seen the photos you showed us. That building isn't a barn anymore. It's kindling. It's a lawsuit waiting to happen. No contractor in their right mind would touch it." But something about that barn called to me. Maybe it was because I'd spent summers there as a child, playing in the hayloft while Grandma Rose tended her garden. Maybe it was because I remembered the smell of old wood and dried flowers, and the way sunlight filtered through the cracks in the walls, creating patterns of light and shadow on the floor. Or maybe I was just tired of my predictable life and looking for something, anything, that felt real. So I did what everyone thought was crazy. I quit my job, ended things with Derek, and moved to Wisconsin with my savings and a dream that even I wasn't sure made sense. The drive from Chicago took 4 hours. I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, when the leaves were just beginning to turn gold and amber. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, tinged with earth and grass and the faint sweetness of wild apples from the abandoned orchard behind the barn. I parked my car in the gravel driveway and sat there for a long moment, staring at the structure I'd just committed my entire future to. Up close, it looked even worse than in the photos. The foundation was crumbling. The walls bowed outward in places. When the wind blew, the whole building creaked and groaned like an old man's knees. "What have I done?" I thought. "What in the world have I done?" But I'd already signed the papers. I'd already given notice at my apartment. I'd already burned my bridges in Chicago. There was nothing to do now but move forward. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and walked across the overgrown yard to the barn's main entrance. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and I had to lean my full weight against it to push it open. It scraped against the floor with a sound like a scream. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. Afternoon light streamed through holes in the roof and the broken windows, illuminating millions of floating dust particles that danced and swirled with every movement I made. The floor was covered in debris. Chunks of plaster, broken glass, pieces of old furniture, and scraps of fabric lay scattered everywhere like the aftermath of some long-ago disaster. In the center of the space sat 2 old orange couches, their upholstery torn and faded, their stuffing spilling out like guts. I recognized them. They'd been in Grandma Rose's living room once, decades ago, before she'd replaced them and moved them out here for storage. Seeing them now, abandoned and deteriorating, made my chest tight with an emotion I couldn't quite name. I walked slowly through the space, my footsteps crunching on the debris. To my right, a wooden staircase climbed up to what had once been a loft. Several of the stairs were missing, and the railing had collapsed entirely. I made a mental note to stay away from it until I could get it reinforced or torn down. The barn was bigger than I remembered. The ceiling soared above me, supported by massive wooden beams that had somehow remained solid despite everything else falling apart around them. Those beams were what made this project possible, according to the structural engineer I'd consulted. If the bones were good, the rest could be rebuilt. I spent an hour that first day just walking around, taking photos, making notes on my phone about what needed to be done. The list grew longer and longer. New foundation, new walls, new roof, new windows, new stairs, new everything, really. The costs piled up in my head until I felt dizzy. I was about to leave when my foot caught on something. I stumbled, caught myself, and looked down to see what I'd tripped over. A piece of the floor had broken away, revealing darkness underneath. I knelt down and shone my flashlight into the hole. There was a space beneath the floor. A crawl space, maybe, or a cellar. The light from my flashlight didn't reach the bottom, but I could see rough wooden walls extending downward. Curious now, I began clearing away more of the debris around the hole. The floorboards in this section were more damaged than elsewhere, soft and spongy with rot. They broke apart easily under my hands. Within 10 minutes, I'd uncovered something that made me sit back on my heels in surprise. A trapdoor. It was about 3 feet square, made of thick planks bound together with iron straps. A heavy iron ring served as a handle. The wood was dark with age and moisture, but unlike the floor around it, the trapdoor itself seemed solid. I pulled on the ring experimentally. The door didn't budge. I tried again, pulling harder this time, putting my back into it. With a groan of protesting hinges, the trapdoor slowly lifted. Stale air rushed out, cold and damp and smelling of earth. I coughed and waved the smell away, then shone my flashlight down into the darkness. A ladder descended into the shadows. It was made of the same dark wood as the trapdoor, and it looked sturdy enough, though I wasn't about to trust it with my weight without testing it first. Below the ladder, I could make out a dirt floor and what appeared to be stone walls. A root cellar, I thought. Grandma must have used it for storage. Old farmhouses and barns often had them, places to keep vegetables and preserves cool before refrigeration became common. But something about it felt different. The construction was too deliberate, too carefully done. And why would she never have mentioned it to me? I'd spent entire summers here as a child, and Grandma Rose had shown me every corner of this property. Every corner except this one. I checked my phone. It was already past 5, and the light was starting to fade. I needed to get to the motel in town where I'd be staying until I could get a trailer set up on the property. Exploring mysterious underground rooms in a structurally unsound building in fading light wasn't smart, even by my recently lowered standards of decision-making. But I couldn't stop thinking about that trapdoor. That night, lying in the uncomfortable motel bed with its scratchy sheets and the sound of the highway outside my window, I stared at the ceiling and wondered what was down there. I tried to remember if Grandma Rose had ever said anything, given any hint about a secret space beneath the barn. But I came up empty. She'd been a private woman in many ways, keeping her thoughts and her past close to her chest. I'd loved her deeply, but I'd never really known her, not the way you truly know a person. The next morning, I returned to the barn with better equipment. A proper work light, a crowbar, gloves, a dust mask, and a first aid kit, because I was clumsy and prone to accidents even in safe environments. I also brought a thermos of coffee and a determination to solve at least one mystery in my life. The trapdoor opened more easily this time, as if it had remembered how. I set up my work light at the edge of the opening and pointed it downward. The ladder was revealed in full now, descending about 12 feet to a packed earth floor. The space below was larger than I'd initially thought, stretching out beyond the reach of my light. I tested the top rung of the ladder with my hand. It felt solid. I put some weight on it. It held. Taking a deep breath and ignoring every instinct that told me this was foolish, I began to climb down. The ladder creaked but held steady as I descended. The air grew cooler with each rung, and damper too. By the time my feet touched the earthen floor, I felt like I'd entered another world entirely, separate from the sunlit ruin above. I picked up my work light and turned slowly, taking in my surroundings. The space was indeed a cellar, but it was much larger than any root cellar needed to be. It stretched the full length of the barn above, supported by thick stone pillars. The walls were stone too, carefully mortared, and the ceiling was made of heavy wooden beams. Empty shelves lined one wall. Against another wall stood a workbench, its surface covered with dust but otherwise intact. And everywhere, covering every surface, were books. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They were stacked on shelves, piled on the floor, arranged in careful rows on the workbench. Old books with leather covers and gold lettering. Newer books with paper jackets, their colors faded. Journals and notebooks and loose sheaves of paper tied with string. I moved closer to the nearest shelf, hardly daring to breathe. My hands shook as I reached for one of the volumes. It was a first edition of The Great Gatsby, protected in a clear archival sleeve. Next to it was an early printing of To Kill a Mockingbird. On the next shelf, I found volumes of poetry by Langston Hughes and Emily Dickinson, copies so old and rare that I was afraid to touch them. But it wasn't just the books themselves that made me freeze in wonder. It was what was tucked between them. Photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, programs from lectures and readings. And everywhere, in the margins of the books and on the pages of the journals, I found my grandmother's handwriting. I picked up one of the journals and opened it carefully. The first entry was dated 1952. Today I met James Baldwin at a reading in Madison. I read, my grandmother's neat script flowing across the page. We spoke for nearly an hour afterward about the responsibility of writers to speak truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. Especially then. He signed my copy of Go Tell It on the Mountain, and told me to keep reading, keep learning, keep questioning. He said the world needs people who dare to think differently. I sank down onto the floor, the journal in my lap, and began to read. The story that emerged from those pages was one I never knew, one no one in my family had ever spoken about. My grandmother, the quiet woman who'd lived alone on this farm for decades, who'd seemed content with her garden and her chickens and her simple life, had once been someone entirely different. In her youth, Rose Walker had been a student, a reader, a collector, and a participant in something extraordinary. She'd traveled to cities, attending lectures and readings by the greatest writers and thinkers of her generation. She'd corresponded with authors and activists. She'd been part of networks of people who passed books to one another, shared ideas, and discussed philosophy and politics and art late into the night. In an era when women, especially farm girls from rural Wisconsin, weren't expected to pursue intellectual lives, she'd built one anyway. She'd saved every penny to buy books, to travel to readings, to attend conferences. She'd hidden this part of herself from her family, who wouldn't have understood, and later from her husband, who'd been a good man but a simple one, content with farming and rural life. This cellar had been her sanctuary, the place where she kept the treasures that mattered most to her. The place where she could be fully herself. I spent the entire day down there, reading through journals and letters, discovering a grandmother I'd never known. I learned that she'd once had tea with Maya Angelou, that she'd attended the March on Washington in 1963, standing in that crowd of thousands, hearing Martin Luther King Jr. speak those famous words about his dream. That she'd corresponded regularly with a professor of literature at the University of Chicago, sending him her thoughts on books and receiving his recommendations in return. And I learned why she'd hidden it all away, not out of shame, but out of self-preservation. In her journals, she wrote about the tension between the life she wanted and the life that was expected of her. She wrote about loving her husband but feeling confined by their life together. She wrote about the guilt of wanting more than the good, simple existence she had. Perhaps, she wrote in an entry from 1967, it is enough to have this secret garden of the mind. Perhaps it is enough to know that I lived another life, even if only in stolen hours and hidden spaces. Perhaps it is enough to be two people, the one the world sees, and the one who exists down here, among these books and these thoughts that will outlive me. But it hadn't been enough. That much was clear from the later entries, the ones where her handwriting grew shaky and her thoughts more melancholy. She'd lived too long in the space between her two selves, and the strain had worn her down. The last entry was dated just 6 months before her death. I wonder now if I should have been braver, she wrote. I wonder if I should have let people see all of who I was, consequences be damned. But we make our choices and live with them. I only hope that someone, someday, will find this place and understand. I hope they'll know that I lived. Really lived, not just survived. I closed the journal, tears running down my face in the dusty darkness of the cellar. I understood now why she'd left me this property. She'd known I was living a half-life in Chicago, pretending to be satisfied with a career that bored me and a relationship that felt more like an obligation than a joy. She'd seen the same split in me that had existed in her, and she'd given me the chance to choose differently. Over the following months, I threw myself into renovating the barn with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I hired contractors and learned to do much of the work myself. I reinforced the foundation, replaced the roof, installed new windows that flooded the space with light. I kept the original beams, sanding them down until they glowed like honey in the sunlight. I refinished the old wooden floors, preserving the trapdoor right where it was, building it into the design rather than hiding it. The 2 orange couches, I had reupholstered. They would stay, both as a memorial and as a promise. What emerged was something beautiful. The barn became a bookstore and community space, a place where people could come to read and think and discuss ideas. I called it Rose's Garden, after my grandmother and after that phrase in her journal about a secret garden of the mind. The cellar became the rare book room, carefully climate-controlled and open by appointment only. I donated many of Grandma Rose's collection to universities and libraries, keeping only those with her notes and the ones that seemed most personal to her story. The space down there now serves as a small museum too, telling the story of a farm woman who built an intellectual life in secret and preserved it for someone who would understand. People did laugh when I opened the bookstore. A barn bookstore in rural Wisconsin. Who would come? But they did come. Slowly at first, then more and more. People from town and from the surrounding farms. Tourists passing through. Book lovers who made pilgrimages to see the rare collections and to hear the story of Rose Walker, the hidden intellectual of Elm Grove County. I live above the bookstore now, in a loft apartment I built into the upper level where the old hayloft used to be. Every morning, I wake up to sunlight streaming through tall windows, and every morning, I walk downstairs to a space filled with books and ideas and the presence of a grandmother who finally gets to be known. My life now looks nothing like it did in Chicago, and I'm grateful for that. I host readings and book clubs. I order coffee from the cafe down the road. I know my neighbors by name. I date occasionally, though I'm in no hurry. I'm learning what it means to be fully myself, all of myself, without apology or concealment. Sometimes, late at night after I've closed up shop, I go down to the cellar and sit among Grandma Rose's books. I read her journals and I add my own entries to a new journal I've started, one that will someday tell my story to whoever comes after me. And I think about choices and courage and the trapdoors that wait beneath our feet, leading to rooms we never knew existed, lives we never knew we could live. They laughed when I bought Grandma's rotten barn. But that trapdoor inside changed everything. It led me down into darkness, yes, but also into light. Into truth. Into a version of myself I didn't know I was looking for. And every day, standing in this beautiful space that was born from ruins, I'm grateful for the grandmother who was brave enough to hide her true self but wise enough to leave me a map to find mine.